He was digging when they found him. 3 holes in the hard ground behind the church, each one measured out with boot lengths, 6 paces long and 3 paces wide, deep enough that the dirt he threw over his shoulder was coming up red. The stranger had taken off his poncho and hung it on the iron fence that surrounded the cemetery, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and he worked the shovel with the steady rhythm of a man who'd done this before and expected to do it again. Scout stood tied to the fence near the poncho, watching the road. The horse hadn't been unsaddled. That meant the stranger wasn't planning to stay long, just long enough to finish the work. The first grave was done, the second was nearly there. He was waist deep in the third when the 3 men rode up from the south end of town and stopped their horses at the edge of the cemetery. They sat in their saddles holding rifles across their chests and looked at the stranger in the hole, and then looked at each other, and then looked at the 3 wooden crosses leaning against the fence, each one already carved, each one waiting to be driven into the ground at the head of a grave. "What are you doing?" the first one asked. He was the biggest of the 3, broad-faced, sunburned, a scar running through his left eyebrow that pulled the skin tight and gave him a permanent squint. The stranger didn't look up. He drove the shovel into the clay and threw the dirt over his shoulder and drove it in again. "I asked you a question." "Digging." "I can see that. Why are you digging 3 graves?" The stranger stopped. He leaned on the shovel and looked up at the 3 men on their horses, squinting against the sun behind them. His face was calm, not aggressive, not afraid, just the face of a man who'd been interrupted during a job and was waiting for the interruption to pass. "Does it matter?" The 3 men looked at each other again. Then the big one laughed. It started low in his chest and came out loud, and the other 2 joined in because that's what men like that do. They laugh when the man in front does. And the sound of it rolled across the empty cemetery and bounced off the church wall and faded into the afternoon heat. "You hear that, boys? Strangers out here digging graves in the middle of the day. Nobody asked him. Nobody died. Just out here digging." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You planning on filling those yourself, stranger?" "Not myself, no." The laughter stopped. Not all at once. It trailed off the way laughter does when something shifts underneath it, and the men laughing suddenly aren't sure what they're laughing at. The big one's smile stayed on his face, but his eyes changed. He looked at the crosses leaning against the fence. He looked at the 3 graves. He looked at the stranger standing in the 3rd hole with a shovel in his hands and no expression on his face. "Who are those for?" The stranger picked up the shovel and went back to digging. He didn't answer. The 3 men sat there for another moment. Then the big one pulled his horse around and they rode back toward the main street, rifles still across their chests. And the stranger listened to the hoofbeats fade, and then the only sound was the shovel in the clay and Scout breathing slow and steady at the fence. He finished the 3rd grave as the sun moved past the church steeple. He climbed out and brushed the dirt from his trousers and pulled his poncho back on and settled his hat and stood looking at his work. 3 graves, open, neat, ready. Then he walked toward the main street with Scout following untied behind him. The town was called Dunmore. It sat at the base of a long, dry ridge where the coach road split, one fork going north toward the territory line and the other going east toward Abilene. It was a split-road town, the kind that made its living off travelers and freight wagons, and it should have been busy. It wasn't. The freight office was shut. The coach station had no horses. The hotel had a sign that said rooms, but the windows were dark. The only building with any life was the saloon, the Dusty Rose, and even that had the quiet of a place where people drank to forget rather than to celebrate. He pushed through the saloon doors and found what he expected. A long room, half empty, a barkeep behind the counter who looked up and then looked down, 2 old men at a corner table nursing beers that had gone flat an hour ago. And at the back, at a large round table, the 3 men who'd found him at the cemetery. They'd beaten him here. Their rifles were leaning against the wall behind them, and they were drinking whiskey and talking low and glancing at the door. When the stranger walked in, they stopped talking. He sat at the bar and put a coin down. The barkeep poured without asking. The whiskey was better than most small towns. Someone had cared about this place once. "Good whiskey," the stranger said. The barkeep was a woman. That surprised him, and it didn't. She was maybe 45, strong hands, gray coming in at her temples, eyes that measured everything twice before committing to a response. She wore an apron that had been white that morning and wasn't anymore. "My husband built this bar," she said. "He had opinions about whiskey." Had. "He died 8 months ago. Heart gave out, that's what they said." "What do you say?" She looked past him toward the 3 men at the back table. Then she looked at the stranger and said nothing. But the nothing said everything. "Who are they?" the stranger asked. "Dale Mercer's men, the 3 you met at the cemetery. Briggs, Holt, and the big one is Loomis. They're the ones who stay in town. Mercer has more out at the ranch. How many more? 9 or 10, depends on the week. And Mercer? She polished the bar with a rag that was already clean. Mercer came about 2 years ago. Bought the Aldrich Ranch east of town. Fair deal at first, paid what it was worth. Then he decided the ranch wasn't enough. He wanted the town. The freight office, the coach station, the hotel, the water rights on Dunmore Creek. He brought a man named Locke. Locke is a lawyer. Always a lawyer. Locke started filing. Tax liens, property disputes, survey challenges. He'd show up with papers that said your land wasn't your land and your water wasn't your water. And if you argued, Mercer's men would come around and explain things in a way that didn't involve paper. How many families? 7 that I know of. The Aldriches sold and left. The Dunbars were driven out, fire in the barn, couldn't prove who said it. The Pritchetts, the Moores, the Hale family, the Garcias, one by one, always the same. Lock files, family fights, men show up, family leaves. And your husband? Her hands stopped moving on the rag. My husband was the last holdout. He owned this saloon and the lot behind it and the water access on the south fork of the creek. Mercer wanted all of it. Eldon told him no. 3 times he told him no. Then Eldon's heart gave out one night while he was closing up. Alone in the bar. Nobody saw anything. Doc Palmer said it was natural. Doc Palmer also got a new buggy the following week. Where's the deed? I have it. Eldon made sure of that. He had a lockbox at the bank in Abilene with copies of everything. The original deed, the water rights filing, every tax receipt going back to '79. He told me if anything happened, I should wait. Don't show anyone. Don't trust anyone. Wait until someone comes who's worth trusting. And you're telling me, you were digging graves behind the church in broad daylight, and you didn't flinch when Loomis laughed at you. That's enough for me. The stranger finished his whiskey. I need to see those documents. And I need to know about Doc Palmer. What about him? A man who signs a false death certificate for a buggy will sign anything for the right price, which means he'll also talk for the right price when the alternative is worse. He worked through the rest of the afternoon. The freight office was run by a man named Garrett Boone, who hadn't shipped anything in 6 months because Mercer controlled the road and charged a toll that made shipping impossible. Boone had kept every toll receipt, not because anyone told him to, but because he was a freight man, and freight men keep manifests and receipts the way other men keep breathing. It was automatic. 14 months of toll receipts showing exactly how much Mercer had extracted from every wagon that tried to pass through Dunmore. The coach station was managed by a woman named Ida Parsons, whose husband had driven the Abilene route for 11 years before Mercer's men beat him on the road and broke both his hands. He couldn't hold reins anymore. He sat in the back room of the station, wrapping and unwrapping his fingers in cloth over and over, a habit that had replaced the one they'd taken from him. But Ida had kept the station logbook, every coach that came and went, every passenger, every delivery. And in the margins, in a handwriting so small you needed good light to read it, notes. Dates when Mercer's men blocked the road, names of drivers who'd been threatened, descriptions of what happened to the ones who didn't comply. The stranger sat in the coach station and read Ida's logbook while her husband wrapped his hands in the other room. When he finished, he closed the book carefully and said, "Your husband's hands. Was it Loomis?" Loomis held him. Holt did the breaking. The stranger nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. Some things you file away and carry quietly and let them do their work when the time comes. There were rules on the frontier that governed men like Mercer. Not written rules. Older than writing. You didn't steal a man's road. You didn't break a man's hands to take his livelihood. You didn't buy a doctor to lie about how a man died. Those rules had names and they had consequences, and every man west of the Mississippi knew them, even if he'd never read a word in his life. The code. The unwritten code that governed everything from how a debt was settled to how a man was buried. How land was really held. What really happened to men who broke the rules. What it meant to give your word and what it cost to break it. Every rule. Every consequence. It's called the Code of the West. It's in the pinned comment. He sent 2 telegrams from the relay station 9 miles north. One to the U.S. Marshal's office, one to the Federal Land Commission. Each telegram contained names, dates, amounts, property descriptions, and the name of Doc Palmer, and the date of Eldon Burke's death, and the date of Palmer's new buggy. He paid the operator double to send them priority and rode back in the dark. Scout knew the road even without moonlight. The horse picked his way along the coach trail with his ears moving and his hooves finding solid ground by feel, and the stranger let him choose the path because Scout had never chosen wrong. He was back before midnight. The town was dark. One light in the saloon where the barkeep, her name was Nora Burke, was still cleaning up. One light at the Mercer ranch house east of town, visible as a yellow dot against the ridge. The stranger sat on the church steps next to the 3 open graves and waited for morning. He found Doc Palmer first. The doctor's office was above the general store, a small room with a desk and a cabinet, and the particular smell of a man who drank alone in a professional setting. Palmer was thin, nervous, the kind of man who had gotten through life by being useful to whoever was most dangerous at the time. The stranger sat down across from him and placed 2 documents on the desk: Eldon Burke's death certificate, which Nora had given him, and the bill of sale for the buggy, dated 6 days after the death certificate, which Boone had found in his freight records. "Natural causes," the stranger said. Palmer's face went gray. "The U.S. Marshal's office has both of these as of last night. A false death certificate is a federal matter when it involves property fraud across county lines. You can talk to me now or you can talk to the marshal later, but the marshal won't care about your reasons." Palmer talked. He talked for 40 minutes. Mercer had paid him $200 in the buggy. Palmer had examined Eldon Burke's body and found bruising on the neck consistent with strangulation, not heart failure. He'd written what Mercer told him to write. He'd hated himself for it every day since, and the buggy sat in his barn because he couldn't stand to look at it. "You'll sign a corrected certificate?" "I'll sign whatever you need." "I need the truth. That's all I've ever needed." He found Locke next. The lawyer operated out of a small office next to the land office, which was convenient because Locke had a key to both. The stranger didn't bother with conversation. He laid out Boone's toll receipts, Ida's logbook, Palmer's corrected death certificate, Nora's deed and water filings, and the copies of 7 property transfers that Locke himself had filed. 7 families, Mr. Locke. 7 properties acquired through manufactured liens and forged tax documents. 1 death that you helped cover up. The Federal Land Commission has all of it. Locke was a small man who wore his collar too tight and his ambition too loose. He looked at the papers on his desk and his face performed a series of calculations that the stranger had seen before on the faces of small men confronted with the consequences of their cleverness. Mercer can't help you. Mercer can't help himself. You can cooperate now, or you can explain to a federal judge why your signature is on 7 fraudulent property transfers and why you held the key to the land office where the original filings were altered. Locke cooperated. The stranger spent the next 2 hours going through the filing cabinets with Locke, separating real documents from forgeries, original surveys from altered ones. When they were done, the desk looked like a map of everything Mercer had stolen. 7 families laid out in ink and stamps and signatures. He sent Nora to talk to the men with families. There were 3 of them among Mercer's crew. She knew their wives. She knew their children's names. She brought them copies of the federal telegrams and told them what Palmer had signed and what Locke had opened. And she told them in the voice of a woman whose husband had been murdered by the man who paid their wages. All 3 were gone by noon. They packed their horses at the livery and rode in 3 different directions without looking back. The kid who worked the livery, barely 19, saw them leaving and asked the stranger what was happening. The stranger told him. The kid took off his gun belt and hung it on a nail and said he'd only been there 2 weeks anyway. He walked north on foot. That left Loomis, Holt, Briggs, and 5 others. And Mercer. Loomis and Holt were harder. They weren't wage men. They were believers. They believed in Mercer the way small, cruel men believe in bigger, cruel men, because the alternative is believing in nothing. The stranger didn't try to flip them. Some men you don't flip. Some men you let the math reach on its own. He went to the remaining 5 instead, one at a time. The federal telegrams, the corrected death certificate, Locke's cooperation, Palmer's statement, the names of the 3 men who'd already left. Each conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Arithmetic doesn't need a long speech. By late afternoon, all 5 were gone. They rode out in pairs and alone, some east, some south, none of them toward the ranch, and the stranger watched each one leave from the boardwalk outside the saloon where Nora stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set. 3 men left, Loomis, Holt, Briggs, and Mercer. The stranger walked to the cemetery behind the church. He stood beside the 3 open graves and waited. He didn't have to wait long. They came from the east road. Mercer on a black horse with Loomis, Holt, and Briggs riding behind him. Mercer was not what people expected. He was older, maybe 60, silver hair under a clean hat, wearing a vest with a watch chain. He looked like a man who sat on town councils and donated to church funds. He looked respectable. The thing about men like Mercer is they always look respectable. That's the weapon. They stopped at the edge of the cemetery. Mercer looked at the 3 open graves. He looked at the crosses leaning against the fence. He looked at the stranger standing between the graves with his poncho moving in the wind and his hands loose at his sides. "You've caused me considerable trouble," Mercer said. "I have. You've turned my lawyer. You've turned my doctor. You've sent my men running." "I have." "Over what? A few land deals? A freight road? A saloon?" "Over a man named Eldon Burke who was strangled in his own bar and buried with a lie on his death certificate. Over 7 families who lost everything to paper that wasn't real. Over a woman named Ida Parsons whose husband can't hold reins anymore because your man Holt broke both his hands." Mercer didn't flinch. Men like him never flinched at facts. Facts were things to be managed, rearranged, filed away. "You're one man standing in a cemetery." "I am. But your lawyer opened his cabinets this morning. Your doctor signed a corrected certificate. The federal marshal has everything. And those 3 behind you," the stranger looked past Mercer at Loomis, Holt, and Briggs. "They're looking at 3 open graves and doing the math." Briggs broke first. He looked at the graves and he looked at Mercer, and he pulled his horse around and rode south without a word. He was the smallest of the 3 and the smartest, and he'd been doing the math since the cemetery that morning when the stranger hadn't flinched. 2 men, Loomis and Holt. Loomis looked at Holt. Holt looked at the graves. The stranger took a step forward. 2 men. That's what's left of everything Mercer built. 2 men and 3 open graves and a federal marshal on the way. He paused. "Those graves aren't a threat. They're a fact. I dug them this morning because I wanted you to see what the end looks like before you get there. You can still ride out. Both of you. Right now." Holt dismounted. He set his rifle against the fence and walked to his horse and mounted again and rode east without looking at Mercer. Loomis watched him go. Then he looked at the stranger, and the stranger looked back and held his gaze the way you hold a rope that something heavy is hanging from, steady and without give. Loomis rode east after Holt. Mercer sat alone on his black horse in front of 3 open graves with no men and no lawyer and no doctor and no paper left to hide behind. The silver hair and the watch chain and the respectable vest meant nothing now. He was just an old man on a horse with the truth laid out in the dirt in front of him. "You have until the federal men arrive," the stranger said. "I'd ride south, long way south." Mercer turned his horse and rode east toward the ranch. The stranger knew he'd pack what he could carry and be gone by dark. Men like Mercer always ran. They counted their losses and they calculated their options and they ran because running was a kind of arithmetic too, and arithmetic was the only language they understood. The town came out the way towns do when the weight lifts. Slowly, one door at a time. Boone opened the freight office and stood in the doorway blinking. Ida Parsons came out of the coach station and stood on the boardwalk and breathed in and breathed out like she was testing whether the air was different now. It was. Nora Burke came out of the saloon. She walked to the cemetery and stood beside the 3 open graves and looked at them for a long time. "You dug 3 graves to scare 3 men," she said. "I dug 3 graves because 3 men needed to see them. And if they hadn't left?" He didn't answer that. He pulled the 3 crosses from the fence and laid them flat in the grass. They wouldn't be needed. Not today. Nora watched him, and there was something in her face that wasn't gratitude and wasn't relief. It was recognition. The look of a woman seeing something she'd been told didn't exist anymore. "Eldon would have liked you," she said. "Sounds like I would have liked him too." He put his poncho on and settled his hat and walked to the fence where Scout was waiting. The horse turned north before the stranger touched the reins. That easy trot that covered miles without announcing them. Nora stood in the cemetery and watched him go until he was a dark shape against the ridge, small and getting smaller. And then she turned and walked back to the saloon and opened the doors wide and poured herself a glass of her husband's whiskey and drank it standing behind the bar he built, in the light coming through windows that weren't dark anymore. Ida Parsons went to the back room where her husband sat wrapping his hands. She knelt beside him and took his hands in hers and unwrapped them gently and held them and said nothing. Because some things don't need words. They just need someone to stop the wrapping and start the healing. Boone was already writing letters. 7 families. 7 addresses. "Come home. Bring your deeds. The real ones. I'll see you on the road." And the code the stranger carries. The one Eldon Burke lived by. The one that said you tell a man no when no is the truth. And you don't sell what isn't for sale. And you pour good whiskey because life is too short for bad. That's in the pinned comment.